we could just exit. Like, we could very quickly start to reconstruct the world on a different basis if we had power. And a lot of that would occur through the socialization of investment and saying, look, we need to direct, our resources toward building a very different future, not a future of these stupid AI data centers, but a future of, clean air, easy transportation, widespread economic security. I think that periods of reaction have also ended in the past. And, we should remember that the biggest waves of revolutionary change occurred in the aftermath of World War I and after World War II, which were the periods when, if you lived through them, you would have said the world is ending. This was all the realities in which people fought for massive change in their world. And so let's not let our rational pessimism prevent us from thinking about and actually planning to build that better world so we're not caught with no ideas, when our chance comes.
Well, guys, hello and welcome to the Dissens podcast. This week on the show, we talk about the vision of a post-capitalist economy, and I'm super stoked to have Aaron Benanav as a guest here at the show. Aaron is a historian and sociologist. You might know him from his book Automation and the Future of Work. And just now, he's coming off the final stage of a research project that is outlining how a transition beyond capitalism would be possible, delivering a framework for a democratically planned economy. So yeah, let's get right to it. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me here on the Dissens podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. We want to talk about democratic planning and a post-capitalist future. But yeah, Aaron, actually, before talking about your idea of a public economy, I want to kick things off with setting kind of the tone for thinking about the future. So maybe we can actually start with your thoughts on the current conjuncture.
Yeah.
So when we look at the politics at the moment, it's kind of a bleak situation. We experience war, climate crisis, or breakdown even, capitalism becoming more and more feudal with oligarchic elites, and sort of also politically an aligning we see with capitalist elites and political monsters such as Trump, in the case of the United States, for instance.
Yeah.
So there's actually a real threat to democracy dying under capitalism in the Western world. So two questions maybe for starters. How do you feel, Aaron, thinking about the current regression? And what are the essentials when one wants to understand from your point of view the current situation regarding how we got here and how we can move forward to a better future? What are in your point of view, the essentials one has to get?
Well, I don't feel good about the regression of the present moment, I have to say. It's very depressing. And I think that the only way I comfort myself in the situation is to think, Aaron, what did you expect it to look like? What did you expect the slowdown and kind of tendential breakdown of the system to look like? Did you think they were going to just say, oh, it looks like we messed up and capitalism isn't delivering the goods that we thought, so here are the keys to society, why don't we try something else? No, of course, as things go badly, as we saw already in the 20th century, capitalist societies turn towards fascism and towards, authoritarianism and even towards genocide. And so it's not really that surprising, the situation we find ourselves in. I think the thing that's particularly depressing about the current conjuncture is just how little power the left has today and how little power there is in the forces of opposition, the forces of emancipation, and so on. And so I consider the work that I've been doing on the character and possibility of a democratic economy to be just a small contribution to rebuilding those forces. Now, when I started the project in 2020, I actually felt like we were in the midst of a wave of revival of social struggles and of movements for a better and freer tomorrow. I think sometimes in Europe and North America, we can become a little bit too strong in the view that wave has ended. Because if you look at South Asia and Southeast Asia right now, there's been a whole range of revolutions. There's actually a kind of Southeast Asian spring going on in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, and other kind of big movements going on in that part of the world. So I think that the wave of emancipatory struggles we've been experiencing is actually still happening. But yeah, just briefly on what I think are the main causes. I really see the main causes as the tendency of mature capitalist economies to stagnate. I think so much of the depoliticization of the period 1950 to 1970s, let's say. I mean, obviously, it was also a period of big social struggles, but economic growth, I think, created a way to say everyone can win. And over the past few decades, we've seen more and more this stagnation, the capacity of rich capitalists to ensure that even as the economy grows more slowly, more of those gains go to owners rather than workers. And that has made the stagnation tendency even worse for working people. There's obviously, neoliberalism is a part of that story, a lot of cuts and austerity to social services. I think that those cuts have kind of been less severe if you look in aggregate than people sometimes claim. Actually, the neoliberal period has seen, it's been very difficult to actually pull back the welfare state as much as people assume, but there is a lot more experience of insecurity and precarity, and of course inequality. So I think that those are the main causes, but you can't really explain what's going on in the world without also thinking about the rise of China, the financialization of economies, the rise of this kind of not just neoliberalism, but neoconservatism and kind of radical right revivals of racism and anti-immigrant sentiment. So I think these are all signs of a society that's really lost its promise. And I think if you look at things like, the kind of AI bubble, you see, in Silicon Valley, all this hype and dream of a new future that I think ultimately won't deliver, let alone won't be satisfying, just they won't be able to deliver on their promises. And so I think the time is ripe to think about alternative solutions. So that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your initial thoughts, Aaron. And Aaron, we definitely going to talk about your project, which is like sketching out what could be concrete and feasible steps towards democratizing our economies. But I wanted to hear a bit more from you actually on the main causes, as you called them, of the regression we are seeing right now. You already briefly hinted towards capitalism running out of steam, the chronic stagnation we are seeing, and capitalism becoming more and more centered around financialized speculation. Maybe to simplify a bit, the change from a market-based, profit-seeking economy to a more financialized and platform-feudal capitalism, where we see like these massive amounts of excess capital floating around financial markets to find like the next big thing. For instance, right now, the AI bubble we see, and there's this uber wealth and oligarchic power of the few. And on the other hand, we see chronically slow growth, low wages and rising prices, as well as austerity for the many. So looking at the long trends, and since you're an historian of economics and politics, that's kind of your specialty. The standard story goes like back to the 70s, I guess, where the industrial model of capitalism went into crisis, where working class unrest was big, actually, and where the system, like including social democracy, imposed neoliberal reforms, which haunt us until today, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, Aaron, I wanted to hear a bit more from you. What, in your point of view, characterizes this late-stage capitalism and what actually got us here? Yeah.
Well, I think you describe all of that pretty well yourself in what you just said. I would say that for me, the key issue is there's been a lot of debates about why capitalism would tend to slow down or go into a crisis mode all throughout the history of the late 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. And I won't go through all the different theories of why that is here. But I'll just say that I think that the theory that was correct was not one that was widely discussed in those debates, which is just that capitalist societies tend to see slowing population growth after a period of a big population kind of boom. The whole world is now entering this population slowdown and crisis much more quickly than demographers had expected. But in the global north, it's been quite extreme. Instead of the population stabilizing, there's a kind of built-in tendency now to slow down. and to go into decline in many countries, including Germany. And so that in itself is actually a big drag on rates of economic growth, right? That when the population doesn't grow, there aren't as many workers. The ratio of old to young becomes very high. That in itself, it just at a very basic statistical level causes a slowdown in the economy. But the bigger trend, in my view, has been the transition from an industrial economy to a service economy. So, my view is that industry, and especially manufacturing, is a sector where you see just a lot of productivity growth. And when the economy is industrializing, it's not just that productivity is growing quickly in industry. It's also that workers are being pulled into industry and into manufacturing from other parts of the economy. That was a big part of the history of Marxism, right? Between the 1870s and 1970s, this idea of the growth of the industrial proletariat and all the effort put into organizing them. So I think that neoliberalism as a political strategy in the 1970s and really 80s and onwards really played a big part in breaking working class organizations. And we certainly see that in countries like Sweden. You still have a very high share of workers in unions, which suggests that there's a big political dimension to this. But on the whole, I think deindustrialization in itself contributed a lot, both to the slowdown of the economy and the breaking of the power of the industrial working class, or where that power wasn't so much broken, maybe in Germany, the increasing use of that power to protect a core workforce and to let many other workers slide into precarious conditions. So I think that, we could talk about the politics, and I think you did a very good job of doing that. But I would just emphasize alongside that these deeper structural forces that have made for, both demographic and structural, that have made for this rapid slowdown in the economy, making it very hard for the engine of the economy to really get going without a huge amount of help from the government. So Germany, really went for extreme national austerity for quite some time. But it had an export engine that then depended on other countries, and especially the United States, going in the other direction and being ultra Keynesian. So a strange feature of the neoliberal era has been this massive increase in government spending and this huge rise in the debt to GDP ratio. So all of these countries have taken on a lot of public debt. And an interesting feature of Germany is they didn't do that. They have a lower debt to GDP ratio. And now they're realizing that, they have to join the wave and are now going to increase their debt insofar as they're able to stimulate the economy, because the private engines of growth are just very unreliable. So I think that forms the backdrop to what you've been talking about. Two trends that are very important. One is that in this environment, corporations realize that they have as their main goal to shore up their markets. They're not trying to expand because the economy isn't really growing. There isn't the creation of, vast new consumer markets for the most part. So it's very important to just set up a lot of walls and lock in your customers. This is related to the phenomenon that Cory Doctorow recently called enshittification, which is where you make this huge effort. It's very common in the digital economy, but it's also in many other parts of the economy.
Kind of the platform economy is becoming the market and controlling everything. Yeah.
But also making it very hard to leave. That's the lock-in effect. It's all these companies do it, whether it's, TV companies or internet companies or even, consumer product companies. They're all trying to create a situation where it's very hard for you to move on to another company. And one way they do that very secretly is actually through a lot of mergers and acquisitions. So you might think by switching, for example, beer, you switch from one beer you used to like to another beer, but it turns out in the global market, all of them are owned by the same company. So you can't get away. And so you have all of these kinds of monopolization or oligopolization tendencies as these giants try to shore up their markets against competitors in an environment where there just isn't growth. And that's going to be a rent-taking economy because they're just not spending very much on investment. But then on the other hand, you have so much money sloshing around in the financial system. A very important part of the story, as I mentioned before, is trying to solve the problem of low rates of growth on the backs of working people by just trying to get taxes down and trying to get wages to stagnate in order to ensure that what little growth there is ends up in the pockets of the rich. But that's created just this massive speculative economy where low rates of return and low interest rates until very recently have just meant that, it makes sense to just throw your money at long shot possibilities. And so we have this massive financialized economy with lots of big bets on things that don't work. And an environment in which, working class people, especially in the absence of any kind of real emancipatory movement they could join, are just trying themselves to get rich, by all kinds of stupid schemes like buying crypto.
But I mean, the system is quite ingenious, right, in making us part of it.
Yes.
Because on an objective level, everyone knows that it's only profiting like mainly the 1%. But this promise that you might be one of the lucky few, that is like pulling us into the system and is making us traders instead of class warriors. So, and we're actually forced to do it because securing a decent life and a decent pension, for example, by just working, that is not working anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, me, myself, I'm invested. I started with the GameStop meme, but there it seemed, okay, you can earn a quick buck and you can also stick it to the big hedge fund guys, but that didn't work out quite well. At least on a larger scale. But yeah, right now I'm invested because of pension reasons. So yeah, it's quite an ingenious system going deep into our psyche, telling us you can do it and you must do it yourself.
Yeah. Everyone is trying to become part of this speculative risk-taking economy because for all the same reason, when there's very little way to get ahead by just working normally and working hard, whether you're an individual or a corporation, you shore up what you have, protect yourself against outsiders, as many people are doing, and then you just speculate and try to make it big. That's your only chance, is to gamble. And so it becomes a gambling society.
Yeah, let's not forget, it's actually no fun, this gamble. I mean, looking at me and listeners will probably relate. People are not investing because it's so fun when the prices go down and you see your money dwindle.
Yeah.
But Aaron, because you talked briefly about the AI boom, and for capitalism, crisis is of course normal. And capitalism tries always to buy itself some more time.
Yeah.
And now we see this AI boom that's supposed, or so they tell us, to revive a stuttering engine of the system. So we see giants like Microsoft, Google, Meta, Amazon, and others that invest billions of dollars into companies like OpenAI.
Yeah.
And they kind of talk about a revolution that will end stagnation. And mainstream discourse is kind of obsessed with the idea that there's an age of technological abundance, where we maybe are even liberated from work. So in the past, you grappled with these oversimplified notions and tech-optimistic notions of automation in your book, Automation and the Future of Work. And now we see kind of these arguments again with artificial intelligence. So maybe you can tell a bit, how do you challenge and actualize your argument against the mainstream automation discourse in the case of artificial intelligence? In your eyes, is AI an hype? Is that a bubble that will burst? And the more important question is, what effects will it have on our jobs and our lives if left to the hands of tech billionaires, I guess?
Yeah. So my basic view is that the AI boom / bubble, it shows you everything I've been talking about so far in great detail, that basically, productivity growth, the dynamism of the system has really dramatically slowed down. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the service sector sees particularly low rates of productivity growth. There's just very few ways to squeeze more productivity out of most service work. Some of it is changing and is becoming industrialized, like warehouse work, for example, at Amazon looks much more industrial than it used to. But for the most part, jobs in healthcare, education, retail, and business services and so on, it's been very hard to raise productivity. And that's why there's all this pressure on service workers to be as productive as possible, because it's like this intensification as an effort to overcome this kind of long-run stagnation tendency. That's why there's productivity talk everywhere, but very little in the statistics, to paraphrase Robert Solow. So with AI and initially with service robots, and then with AI, there was this big dream that Silicon Valley is going to solve this problem, just like an engineering problem. They're going to just, brute force, get out of it. And you can see why they think this is worth so much money, because if they can overcome the stagnation tendency in the service economy, it would really revive the engine. So many jobs for so long have seen so little productivity growth that if you can break through that, you would generate quite a boom. My work, I try on this stuff to be a careful empiricist. And so one problem is that with the AI stuff, we haven't really seen its effects yet in the economy. It's too soon to tell. So I usually feel it necessary to make that caveat, because I don't trust the experimental studies where they try to isolate the tools and try to show what effect it will have outside of actual business contexts. And so, what I'm going to say is more speculative than what I normally say. But I do think that the effects on productivity growth so far have been limited. There's a big study that came out a few months ago by MIT that surveyed all of these companies that were spending a lot of money on AI, and 90 to 95% of them said that they hadn't actually seen any benefit from the technology. I think there is a certain amount of work that people can do more quickly. But there are also studies that suggest that it's essentially what's changing are the cognitive tasks involved. So the load of work is less, but actually the time is not necessarily less as people think. And then a new trend, which I think is really interesting, is that a lot of workers are using ChatGPT to generate sort of AI slop. So instead of doing their work, they're letting the machine do the work for them. But of course, what they produce is very low quality. So it makes more work for their colleagues. And so it's actually a way that these technologies might be a drag on productivity rather than a stimulus to it.
Unconscious sabotage.
Yeah. And so, when you add it all up, I think, and what's been coming out in the past few weeks is essentially that NVIDIA, which has been the biggest winner so far from the AI boom, because they produce the chips that the whole thing runs on.
Yeah.
And essentially, very few people are buying these services who are not already part of the AI economy. So essentially, what NVIDIA is doing is they are creating a lot of relationships with OpenAI and also with these cloud server, like services that are like Amazon Web Services, which is Amazon's biggest moneymaker, but specifically for AI, because the data centers you need for that are very specific AI data centers. They're incredibly expensive to build, and they're very specialized, and they will be outdated also very quickly. So there's just all these circles of investment where NVIDIA is kind of loaning money to companies to buy their chips to kind of keep the whole thing going. And so I think we're entering the real sort of, final phases of this, of the bubble.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a pyramid scheme where the big boys at the top are plotting together to create all this hype that has actually no real base.
And it's also like when the most money gets lost, is at the end. I think that things are entering the high phase of, a sucker is born every minute kind of thing. And that will pop. And I'm trying to figure out now, I'm very curious to know what kind of hole it will punch in the economy, A lot of stock market growth has been through NVIDIA and these few companies, AI promising companies. A lot of investment has been through what they call CapEx, like capital expenditure, like investment of these few companies in building data centers. So I'm trying to figure out myself what kind of hole it will punch in the economy, how widespread or narrow it will be in its effects.
Another 28?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think it's it's a kind of empirical question that requires a lot of investigation. So I'm trying to figure that out now. But it's just very sad because, they're spending $1 trillion building this mountain of junk that won't really work and that'll be outdated quickly. And it's like the exact amount of money that we could have been spending to do the green transition, and investing in like actual transformative technologies. So something I often say is like, I'm a skeptic of Silicon Valley and the promises they make about robots and AI, but I'm not an anti-tech person. And I actually think if you look in the green space, as it were, at what's gone on with batteries, solar panels, wind power, and so on, you see that like humanity is still capable of incredible dynamism in solving problems. That's not the issue. And so, in China, like the cost of wind and solar energy is just falling so dramatically, and the batteries are getting better and better. And we could take all this money we're using to build these energy-eating data centers and build the technologies and improve the technologies, but also roll out the technologies of the green transition. So it's maybe in the long run the most insane feature of the situation is this is the fact that we're spending money on these data centers rather than on solar panels.
Yeah, totally. And we want to talk about the potential also of digital technologies like big data, algorithms, and maybe also artificial intelligence when it comes to a democratically planned society, because technology also holds some potentials for a planned economy.
Yeah.
But of course, in the hands of tech companies, it will only worsen our lives and our jobs, I guess. Digital algorithms in the gig economy, for example, we see that automation leads to a lot of de-skilling and also surveillance. So maybe you can talk a bit about that, what artificial intelligence or digital transformation in general could do to our jobs, to our lives in the end, especially when it comes to the service economy, because you talked about in the past, automation was a thing like in the industrial economy, like the auto plants and stuff like that, of course. But now we see like they aim for the healthcare sector heavily, education, retail, hospitality, stuff like that. So yeah, maybe you can touch upon that, what AI left to the billionaires might do to our jobs and lives.
Yeah. Well, I think you describe it quite well, that those two tendencies, de-skilling and digital surveillance, are the main ones that I've pointed to about sort of how AI is really transforming work, where it is transforming work. I think when I talk about de-skilling, I often talk about Uber, because if you look at the history of how digitalization has transformed work, there is a tendency of digital transformation to upskill work. That is to say that maybe the work gets a little bit more productive, but at the same time, the worker has to learn new skills, right? Think about like the computerization of manufacturing, for example. There are still line workers, doing old style jobs, but a lot of the jobs that are now in manufacturing actually require all these additional skills that they didn't before. Mm-hmm. What's new about this wave of digital transformation is that it is de-skilling some work. So, for example, to be a taxi driver, you used to have to know all the roads. And now with Google Maps, anyone who can drive a car can also be a taxi driver. And that's sort of the main thing Uber takes advantage of. At the same time, Uber uses very few human managers. They don't use any managers to kind of manage the fleets of cars. It's all done algorithmically. And so it's actually an automation of management that is taking place partially in the case of Uber. And so I see that as a possible model that could be rolled out. I think people overemphasize the platform economy because there was a kind of idea that every kind of work would be platformified. And I think that the truth is that a lot of work doesn't work that well that way. And actually, even Uber has a lot of problems organizing fleets of taxis that way. And they make a lot of effort to trick workers into redistributing themselves around a city, because it doesn't work that well for a lot of the kinds of tasks we have to do. But I think that what generative AI might allow, and we see this maybe in law and computer programming, technical writing, graphic design, is that because these models are trained on all of this work that people have already done, they can kind of like Uberify in the sense of de-skilling by automating a lot of the more cognitively skilled parts of a job. Mm-hmm. They can de-skill workers. And there are experiments that have shown this, that, if you have, for example, proofreading, these generative AI technologies like ChatGPT will raise the productivity of the least good proofreaders but not have a big effect on the best proofreaders. So it's better at making low-skilled workers perform like medium-skilled workers than it is in raising medium or high-skilled workers' productivity. And, one of the biggest uses of ChatGPT so far has been to help students cheat. Why is that? Well, students are low-quality workers, low-skilled workers, and they're trying to learn how to be average skilled. And those are precisely the kinds of workers that this technology is able to help the most. But students cheating are going to find that they just become the kinds of workers that, the system wants to do this kind of de-skilled low-wage work. And at the same time, all of these technologies, insofar as they're just generating, they make it possible for to recognize patterns in data. And so the more it gives a lot of incentive to employers to surveil, to watch over and collect a lot of data about what their workers are doing, and then look for patterns in it that help them discipline those workers, which also allows them to pay less. So I think that those two tendencies are just, a big part of how these technologies will actually be implemented. But if they don't generate the productivity boom, then it'll just be, it'll be those technologies more or less as the big outcome, which would never justify the amount of money being invested in these technologies. These technologies will only make good on their investments if they generate gigantic productivity increases. This is more like squeezing a little extra water out of a rag, these kinds of de-skilling and digital surveillance stuff. And of course, Uber isn't actually a highly profitable company. So,
yeah. So, Aaron, I wanted to finish this part by asking you, before we then turn to the socialization of the economy, to stick in it to the uber rich. I wanted to ask you what you think will be a likely scenario for the near future of capitalism. Of course, this is kind of speculative, but I would be interested what trajectory you're seeing there.
Yeah.
And maybe in answering that, you can talk a bit about the economic policies that we're seeing right now, because they are sort of the system's answer to those larger trends of chronic stagnation that you already described. So we see that governments all around the world are breaking from neoliberal orthodoxy. We see growing deficit spending. They are pumping like billions of dollars into the economy. We see a return of Keynesian stimulus policies, so to speak. Like here in Germany, for example, where the debt brake actually prevailed for so long. Now the government is pumping like these billions of dollars into the economy.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they go from a left perspective into all the wrong places. Like, for example, military spending, car infrastructure, and border control, instead of what we actually would need, like public housing, hospitals, and green transition.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we also see, like, then again, out of the neoliberal playbook, policies that slash like the welfare state, for example, and that actually aim to make our lives more precarious in order to make capital accumulation more easy. So we're actually seeing kind of these two-faced economic policies, like a combination of zombie neoliberalism and a sort of regressive Keynesianism. But yeah, I wondered how you see those policies as a reaction to the system, which is kind of in chronic stagnation, and what they mean for the future of the system, and also where you're seeing capitalism heading.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously a speculative question, hard to say, but I think that what we are seeing now is that as the economy stagnates, and there's I already described a kind of relationship between economic stagnation and inequality, that when the economy isn't growing that fast and capitalists have a lot of power, social power, they're able to capture most of those gains, right? So, you have a slow-growing economy, but it's really stagnant for working people, and actually rich people can see their incomes grow pretty quickly because there's very few of them capturing, this overall small amount of growth, but for a very tiny number of people. And inequality in itself then further contributes to stagnation because rich people save a lot of money rather than spending. And so you get this huge wealth effect where societies are becoming richer and richer in wealth terms, because the rich are becoming richer and richer, not everybody. But income growth is really even further lagging behind. The reason why I mention that in this context is that it's a great environment for doing Keynesianism. Like the economy is kind of permanently running below full resource utilization. And that basically means you can print money and stimulate the economy without causing inflation. That breaks a lot of the ideas about how capitalism is supposed to work, right? Because capitalism is based on private property, and every dollar is supposed to belong to someone. And so, unveiling the secret of the system that actually, money can be created and spent, especially by the state, to stimulate the economy, has always been this sort of thing that capitalist powers are very uncomfortable with, especially because they don't want people on the left to get a hold of this technology. And so, but what we've seen in the context of decades of stagnation and increasing recognition that just freeing market forces will not stimulate the economy, there's this increasing recognition on the right that they need to just spend a lot of money. And it's incredible how much money they're spending in the United States. I think people don't realize there's a lot of talk about how the US economy is growing faster than the European economy, and a lot of different explanations for why. And I never understand how people don't talk about the fact that the US is spending like wartime levels of a deficit. It was 6% going up to 7%. They're just spending huge amounts of money to stimulate the economy. And now Europe is trying to do the same thing, especially Germany. I have a friend, Nick Johnson, who pointed something out I think is very important. He said that in different societies, there are these kind of veto points on spending money. Like there's all these ways to block spending money. Obviously, in Germany, you had this constitutional debt brake to block spending money. In the United States, it's this much more Byzantine political system with so many ways that people can stop spending. Look, we have a government shutdown happening literally right now for, whatever unclear reason. And so what politicians find is that the best way to break these vetoes is to claim a need to spend money for the military. Basically, it's very hard to oppose a lot of deficit spending if you claim it's for national security. Politicians don't want to be against that. And so I think that's just what you'll see more and more of. It's just like, there aren't really, there are limits to the kinds of debts economies can create. In Germany, there's a lot of really false ideas about this. I've been at talks where people, have mentioned the idea of spending money in Germany to grow the debt to, save the economy. And some people just start saying, well, you don't understand hyperinflation 19. It's just so dumb. And it's a very outdated conversation in that country.
Yeah, that's a super weird trauma, I guess. But even though there's no base for this, it's so deeply part of our national consciousness.
Yeah.
Part of the reason, I guess, why it took this country so long compared to other countries to change economic policies and get rid of the debt brake.
Yeah. But you can kind of see how social material forces win in the end, right? Like even with all that, Germany is now doing the thing.
Yeah, it's been a hardcore neoliberal chancellor, a conservative who got rid of the debt brake.
Exactly.
Being caught by reality, I guess. But even though that was necessary, in itself, it's not progressive because in the end, we see this war Keynesianism pumping all the money in the wrong places.
Yeah. So just to shorten the point here, like in Japan, the debt is over 240% of GDP. So it can get very high. And I think you're going to see countries doing that. They're going to do it for militaristic reasons. There's going to be a lot of, xenophobia. The big trend of the future is just obviously warming temperatures and increase in climate migration. And I think northern, temperate zone economies are going to build up massive immigration forces to control and try to block these people from coming in. We're already seeing that in the U.S. with the growth of ICE and the patrolling of cities like L.A. and Chicago. So I think the big trends are this kind of combination of neo-reactionary Keynesianism of this kind of highly conservative, military-oriented form and major investments in immigration control and preparation for waves of climate migration. Mm-hmm. And I think the factor which, we don't know is just whether the fact that China has managed to just, drop the price of solar so much is going to have some effect. So countries in the global south like Pakistan and Nigeria, where they suffer from a lot of energy blackouts, there's just this mass spending spree to buy solar panels because they're just so cheap and it's a way to stop blackouts from happening. So it could be that the world kind of solarizes anyway through through purchases of Chinese solar panels. So I think there are aspects of the situation that could be different, but I would say that's where I unfortunately see things heading if we don't change direction soon.
Yeah. And when it comes to this political landscape that you described, especially with regards to the economic policies, is there also an opportunity for the left and for socialists to intervene? Because what we see with these Keynesian policies is also a hint towards kind of a socialization of investment, which is kind of an important theme in your vision of transitioning towards a post-capitalist economy, putting investment capabilities into the hands of the people. I would be interested in if you see also a jumping point from these debates around economic policies right now, as regressive as they are, for the left.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that what's going on today is breaking all of these economic orthodoxies that have been around now for a number of decades. And they are breaking both because of the success of Chinese industrial policy that I've mentioned a few times, and because of the ever more extreme crisis tendencies of the West, and especially, as I think we've started to indicate, like all the attacks on the independence of the central bank in the U.S., purchasing of portions of companies by the state, and massive deficit spending. All of these things point to the possibility, we could just exit. Like, if emancipatory governments came to power and were able to thread the needle of actually being able to do what they want to do, which is really hard in the face of capitalist opposition, we could sort of get ourselves on track incredibly quickly, because we could start to shut down all of this completely stupid and pointless financial speculation and redirect a lot of resources towards meeting people's needs. First and foremost, building housing in cities, reconstructing broken healthcare systems, and in some cases, like in the U.S., education systems as well, and doing the green transition and making the green transition not a kind of virtue signaling middle class thing, but a real mass experience of transformation that makes life better. There's this idea that would be very important to an actual green transition of what they call 15-minute cities, which is the idea that you should be able to walk and bike to everything you need. It creates all this community, it creates a lot less stress in people's lives. It could be associated also with a lot of movements to like a 4-day work week and work-life balance. So we could very quickly start to reconstruct the world on a different basis if we had power. And a lot of that would occur through the socialization of investment and saying, look, we need to direct, our resources toward building a very different future, not a future of these stupid AI data centers, but a future of, clean air, easy transportation, widespread economic security, good quality education, and healthcare and so on. So I think that working on this project just really convinced me, like, there's no stagnation in the heart of humanity. The stagnation is on the part of capitalism. Now, the future world I'm describing might not be a high economic growth world, because the kinds of investments we need are not necessarily efficiency enhancing investments, but the dynamism of society would come, one, from the experience of suddenly using all of our resources and not living in this world of a scarcity of jobs anymore, but a world where there's so much to do. There's so much we have to do, and no one feels useless or like what they're doing is bullshit. And the other feature of dynamism would be this massive improvement we could win in quality of life that isn't ultimately about, just how much you can buy with your take-home income, but how rich your world is in all these different ways. So I think it would be a very different world of dynamism. We don't really have a clear conceptual framework to describe what I'm talking about, which is a high investment, low growth society, which is what I think we would end up with. Not necessarily even because we wanted to, but because of those strong limits of service sector productivity growth I described before. A lot of the services we need to invest in would not be high productivity growth activities. And so we'd have this dynamic, high investment, but low growth society. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you actually gave the perfect example, Aaron, for such a high dynamic but low growth or even post-growth society, because such a 15-minute city, we covered this concept here in the podcast before, would entail the massive reduction of privately owned and driven cars and a massive shift towards other forms of mobility, including good quality public transportation, which deliver much less growth but are like better for our lives. So, but then again, of course, such a world will only be possible if we break with capitalism and move towards a democratically planned economy. So, Aaron, kind of a perfect stepping stone to actually now talk about your contribution to the debate.
Yeah.
I mean, you've been engaged with this debate for years now, but just recently you published like a big piece, actually a 2-part piece, which tries to lay out, from your point of view, first important foundations for a post-capitalist economy that moves away from the profit motive, that socializes investment. And the second piece is on more specific institutional settings that a democratically planned economy would have to entail.
Yeah.
Of course, here's not the room for laying out this proposal like in fine detail. I encourage all the listeners to go and read your piece. I'm going to link that in the show notes. But maybe you can spark our imagination a bit, if we could seize power and if we could seize it differently. Yeah, of course. What could be possible and what questions do we have to tackle maybe now and engage with now when it comes to moving to a planned and especially a democratically planned economy, because we don't want to end up like the Soviet commando economy in the past, for example. So maybe you can describe to our listeners your central ideas. What are the basic premises you start with in your way of thinking about post-capitalist economy? And maybe what's the core argument of how to move beyond capitalism?
Yeah, so I think the best way to describe that as a kind of follow-up to everything we've said so far is really about the potential of the socialization of investment. The kind of core idea that I'm working with is that insofar as capitalism is this private, profit-based economy, the thing about profit is the way capitalists make profit is by focusing rather ruthlessly. In the case of corporations, actually, it's a little less ruthlessly, but focusing in general very ruthlessly on efficiency gains. It's, in order to make a profit, what you have to do is you have to cut costs and expand revenues. Those are the two ways you earn more. And it's a kind of a game to make as much money from your investments as possible. So to invest as efficiently as possible from the perspective of the profits that investment generates. And that's what has made capitalism dynamic in the past. The absence of those potentials for productivity growth are why it's very stagnant now. But it's really a system built around this goal, and that's what drives its kind of boom-bust cycles and so on. And so I think that a future economy would have to take over this investment function and make it public. And what I really stress is that once investment is no longer about earning a monetary rate of return, but is really about investing to make life better in whatever ways we can, to transform production in whatever ways we can, it really frees us to redirect not just investment, but technological change to serve many different goals. So, for example, if we live in a public economy where firms or whatever the producers are, they could be worker managed and so on. They aren't focused on making a rate of return, but just meeting people's needs. Then our investment process can have all of these other goals. We could invest in sustainability, like transforming all of production to be green, and not just in the sense of not producing carbon, but in all of these other terms that respecting planetary boundaries, as they say, across all these different dimensions. We could invest in making work good for people. Like, imagine if consulting firms were no longer like McKinsey, just out to ruthlessly, increase profits, but we're like trained in figuring out how do we reorganize production to improve workers' experience of their work. We could invest huge amounts in improving that, especially improving dignity for workers who are generally mistreated, like cooks and cleaners and childcare people and so on. We could invest in, rebuilding communities. We could invest in beauty and so on. And there's so many things we could do if we freed investment from the constraint of profitability. In a way, what I'm interested in is an old Marxist idea of unfettering, the forces of production from the relations of production. But for me, that unfettering is not about unleashing a potential for economic growth and an increase of production like we haven't seen before, but rather unfettering it to access all of these dimensions of change that we haven't been able to access. But the thing that I really emphasize, which is the other second core idea of the piece, is that if we did that, there wouldn't just be one future we could go toward. The left has too often thought in terms of a post-capitalist society being a harmonious society, a society without conflict or even without politics. And what I try to show is that once you have many goals, it also means that there's going to be trade-offs across those goals. There is a future that is sustainable, good quality work, lots of free time, community, individual autonomy, so on and so forth. There isn't just one of those. There are many different ways of doing that. And to some extent also that difference results from different ways of prioritizing across those goals. So I think that basically, even as we push towards a better world, we will have to choose which better world we want to be in. And that requires a lot of politics, and it creates a lot of space. And this is very against, I don't want anyone to think I'm like a Keynesian, because I think Keynes came up with a lot of interesting tools, but he was an extreme technocrat. And what I'm proposing is a vision in which there's no single best, optimal, technically determined future. There are many futures, and we need democracy to choose among them. So a lot of the institutions I describe in those pieces are institutions that allow people or give people a chance to kind of surface their ideas about the kinds of futures they want to inhabit, and also to choose among those futures democratically. And for me, that's really where democracy is located. It's not just an idea about an economy, where we use production for the people to meet their needs. It's not just an economy where it's very transparent and workers are checking to make sure it's fair. Those are two models of democracy you get in the 20th century. I'm proposing something else, which is that democracy is really choice across alternative futures. It's a vision you get sometimes with Engels and a few other, and Marx, in like tiny passages, this idea that what comes after capitalism is this age of human freedom, really. And I try to actualize that in the idea that that it's that once progress is no longer capitalist progress, and it's this much more open conception, then we need a lot of different ways to build that out as a possible thing for people to choose. And that also requires a lot of liberal freedoms and protections. We need a society where people have the right to organize, the right to associate, free time to participate in civic life, without those things becoming overwhelming. I'm very against the idea that we should be trying to build a society where people spend all their times in meetings, or something like figuring out how to live rather than living. But I do think that that the future really needs to make a lot more space for people to collectively make decisions over their future. So there's a lot of other pieces. There's, ideas about how markets fit in to this society. There's this idea about a dual currency as a way to solve the problem of integrating markets into capitalism. There's multiple currencies. There's all these other fun pieces that, we could talk about or that readers could read about in the articles if they want.
Yeah, for sure. If they want to, they must actually, because we can only scratch like the surface here in this podcast. But yeah, I actually quite like your proposal because it's so radically democratic. It's not about, this is the path we have to go. It's more about freeing us from the forces of the market and providing us the framework to actually choose between different futures, including trade-offs between, for example, the level of wealth our societies aspire to and the ecology, the planetary limits. But maybe talk about some of those fun pieces you mentioned. And first and foremost, I would be interested in what could actually be, in your mind, a concrete institutional framework for the democratization of investment, socialization of investment?
Yeah.
Because when we look at today, when investments are politically planned, it's usually done in the realm of parliament, with the state serving as sort of a general capitalist. And to change all that, you kind of propose these democratically elected investment boards, and I imagine they would have to be even more radically democratic than the traditional workers' councils. But explain a bit what you have in mind there.
Yeah. So in this post-capitalist economy, the way that investment is sort of organized and planned is as follows. So you could have, let's say, 20 sectors across the economy, very similar to the way that the OECD currently divides up the economy into all these sectors like mining, manufacturing, business services, healthcare, education, so on. They could each have their own investment board. And in a sense, the investment board would be a space of self-management of the industry. But who is part of that self-management is different than the way it was conceived in kind of councilist models of proletarian democracy, for example, in Germany and the Netherlands. So it's very important that this investment board is not managing all of the connections across the firms. Like, they actually are free to participate in market exchanges to figure out, who their suppliers are and, what kind of stuff they want to make with what they have. Although the markets are modified by this dual currency system, so you can't make a profit from market engagement. You can't save these production tokens and then convert them either into investment resources or into personal incomes. So there's no accumulative function within these markets, but there's a lot of freedom to organize that. And it allows the planning part of society, the investment part of society, to really focus on the thing that matters, which is transforming production. And the idea is that just as profit-oriented investment organizes all of the economic activity in the day-to-day of capitalism, so too this kind of public multidimensional investment in this future society will organize and shape all of the day-to-day decisions lower down. But in any case, when I talked about this broader concept of the self-management of these investment boards, what I mean is that there have to be multiple stakeholders involved and electing or otherwise sending representatives to these boards. So they function almost like industrial congresses for each sector, debating the future of that sector. Mm-hmm. And they would, of course, have to involve workers from the sector, serving terms of whatever length in these boards. There would also have to be customers, which could be other businesses or consumers, depending on the sector. There would have to be some role for technical experts, whether they serve a kind of advisory role or actually on the boards is an interesting question. I talk a lot about how to democratize expertise. So how technical experts would themselves be elected representatives of different technical associations and professional associations, which would cover all workers in society. And, a general part, which represents the wider community associations, civil society organizations, and so on. And the idea is that these groups would be deciding what the future of the industry is, how to invest and transform it over time. And what they would be doing is both calling for and evaluating proposals that come from or at least attach to firms or producers within the industry. So, for example, in healthcare, you could imagine all of these clinics and hospitals and other groups kind of saying, here's what we are proposing to do, to change for the future, to expand our services, to focus on mental health care, to focus on, other improving quality of nursing, their satisfaction, improving sustainability of resource use. And you have this kind of board or Congress that's a political organization, democratically brought in somehow. And I don't care. I think there's many different ways to think about how you'd get people on those boards democratically. And I think we should be open to experimentation. But they will vote on how to use the investment resources they have for that year or period. And then you just perform that operation over and over again. Mm-hmm. And what happens is that each industry becomes a kind of space of argument, discussion, conflict, and generative ideas about how to move forward within that sector, whether it's, as I said, manufacturing or childcare or, education. There's this kind of internal debate that's expressing itself through this democratically made investment decisions about how to move forward. It's important to say that's not all investment decisions. A lot of investment is just repair and replacement, and that could be organized by just dispersing to producers some quantity of funds just for to pay for those kinds of investments. You also have cross-sectoral investments, and there's a whole discussion of how, for example, if you want to do the Green New Deal, or if you want to reduce the work week by a day a week, or if you want to do reparations, there might be all these things that are cross-sectoral activities. So you would need separate bodies, also democratic, to do that. That's as short as I can make it on what that is.
Yeah, again, I encourage our listeners to dig into your work. And as I understand it, this might be part of a later book project. So looking forward to reading this. But yeah, actually 2 follow-up questions regarding your work or your project on the public economy.
Yeah.
One is regarding property relations, and the other one is regarding the role of markets. Speaking to the first one, there's a lot of talk about the role of the state in making plans in today's economy. But at the same time, there's also ideas about combining state planning with privately owned firms. One example for such a proposal is Mariana Mazzucato's mission economy, for example, where it's about a strong government proposing plans and involving privately owned firms. And I don't actually see that working. But at the same time, socialist transformation like you wish for is only going to come from the bottom up, from workers, from housing tenants and so forth.
Yeah.
When there's enough pressure from below to actually change also state policies. So I don't see any progressive or socialist party winning elections and then just by being in power transforming the economy on such a deep level. So I guess my question is how you imagine that together, the broader socialization of investment and the socialization of the means of production there.
Yeah.
And yeah, the other thing is markets, because this is always a hot topic. Should markets play a role in a post-capitalist society? And if so, how should they be designed? So I guess my question is how you think about markets and socialism there.
Yeah. So I think socialization of investment, to me, has a very specific meaning, even within a capitalist economy. So you haven't socialized investment until the government, basically, in a capitalist economy, controls the total level of investment, really controls it. And in Keynes's mind, that involved 2 things. One is a radical increase in the public share of investment to be 60 to 75% of all investment. And the other thing you need is veto power over the investments of corporations. So the only way that you can actually control the total amount of investment is if private firms no longer have the right to make their own investment decisions. They can propose investments, but those investments have to be approved. Mazzucato, they're not proposing socialization of investment. They're just proposing more public investment and more public-private agreements. They're not actually proposing a system where capitalists are brought to heel in that way. Now, in my model, I'm talking about a fully public system. So there is no more 25% private investment that's vetoed. You've transitioned to a fully public economy with no private firms at all. In that kind of economy, what you would need to do is you would need to first socialize investment. You'd have to also set up capital controls. So your capitalists cannot leave the country or send their money abroad. And then you have to massively tax them to reduce their political power. Mm-hmm. But in order to actually transition firms, what you would do is you'd start off with that kind of capitalist socialization of investment. So there's still private firms, but the state has veto power over their activities. And then you just create a lot of incentives and have a structured system where workers can vote to transition their firms over to the public side. And, you'd want to do that in a really organized way because when workers take control over firms, especially before you split the currency in the way you describe, there's a lot that's complicated about that. So you can't just sort of And workers have to have a lot of buy-in in that transition. They have to actually want to transform and take over those management roles. And especially for a large company, they're going to need a lot of help to do it. So I think, we want that to be a voluntary process, and we want to create a lot of space for it. And the way we fit it in is by ensuring that while we're in this transitional phase where there's still private companies, that there's this kind of veto power over their investment decisions. It's very important that to make the transition, you'd have to start off with one single investment board that is state controlled. But you'd want to, as people, you couldn't make a transition without massive mobilization of the population. And you'd very quickly want to organize those mobilizations so that they can start creating plans for investment and plans for the future. And the way I imagine it is that, you have these proto-sectoral investment boards that at first gain veto power over the National Investment Board's decisions, and then increasingly power is directly devolved to them as they become more democratic and responsive, and also work out a kind of culture of accountability. So I think that's how you do it. But in the end, you want to have a system where firms are, I would say, worker managed. The workers have a lot of autonomy as long as they're running the companies in a way that is we could just say coherent. Then they maintain their autonomy. But if they cannot balance their own budgets, if they can't equalize, sales and purchases, then they go into receivership, which means they lose their autonomy and can be dissolved. Mm-hmm. Now, that implies the existence of markets, which is the other part of your question. There's a lot of really interesting histories that I can't go into of all of the efforts to think about how you make markets and socialism work. And I think a lot of that comes down to the idea that the problem with markets and capitalism is that money is both a means of exchange and a store of value. Markets have existed for a very, very long time, even including long distance trade. But you didn't really have this capacity to, take money and then purchase like means of production or kind of forms of productive wealth that you could then use to like generate more money. So, in the terms of Marx, in many ways, it was a CMC world, a world where people were exchanging things and money was an intermediary or a means of exchange, not an MCM prime world where money functions as a store of value. And the goal is to always kind of get more money. There were capitalists, but they had limited existence as merchants, and they mostly existed to arbitrage different prices across space, not actually investing in improving productivity. So in any case, what we need is once again a form of money that is a means of exchange that helps organize exchange, but cannot function as a store of value. So there's no ability to say, oh, I didn't spend this currency, so I'm going to take it and it becomes mine. It either becomes my personal income or it becomes a source for accumulation or investment in the future. So by splitting the currency and having a credit currency, which is used for a lot of purchases of consumers and households, and it's important to say there, as you were kind of indicating, a lot of what households receive would be through public services. So a lot of it would be non-market at the consumer level, but there's always going to be a role for some kind of markets. Most people understand that people should have the ability to choose and shape, on a personalized way, like when it comes to clothing or vacations or a whole range of things. They should have that choice that markets enable. But a lot of that could be non-market. But the point is that interfirm exchanges for day-to-day operations need to be marketized. And because of this split, companies would have no reason to hoard or not spend their production tokens because they can't translate them into credit. So they can't turn them into personal income. And because of the way the investment system is organized, they also can't use them to invest. And the idea is that these production tokens would be pumped into the economy and they would actually disappear and be removed from the economy if they're unspent or when they're spent in certain ways that the piece describes. And so the result of this is that you can have markets on both the consumer and the production side, but they don't function like capitalism because there's no store of value function. on the part of the production currency. And that frees us to allow for a lot more distributed activity and actually multi-criterial and multi-dimensional activity as well. One of the big problems with central planning is that because it was so centralized, it was really difficult to incorporate all of these other goals into the organization of the economy. And I explained in the piece how you can combine this new type of currency with multidimensionality to build a really dynamic, multi-goal kind of system.
It's so unfortunate we gotta hurry because the time is almost up. We didn't unfortunately have time to talk specifically about the potentials and limits of technology, but I guess you pointed towards the importance of deliberation for a post-capitalist democracy, but also using technology for making processes more efficient, at least some processes, because we don't want to sit in meetings all day long, as you said, for sure. But I guess that's going to be a relation that needs to be open, or at least in favor of deliberation, to not become like a technocracy.
Yeah.
And yeah, another thing we only touched upon is care and unpaid care work. But I guess one can see how such a feminist perspective of giving value to care work more, to human relations, how that could integrate in your framework. So,
yeah.
But yeah, we got to hurry, Aaron. And so one of my last two questions is regarding how we can actually bring the planning debate, which is it's oftentimes quite academic or activist-based, how we can bring that more into the day-to-day politics and into the daily life of working people, because they, in the end, have to push for such an agenda.
Yeah.
So yeah, for sure, we need like these full-fledged proposals, but maybe also like narratives, like a transformational agenda, and maybe think in terms of radical reforms that both make the lives of people better in the here and now, but also open like a gateway towards bigger changes. So I wondered how you think about this feat of like popularizing the planning debate, I guess. Yeah.
I think it's really easy to do that. And I don't think we need to sort of think like, oh, well, little prying open space. No, we can just do the reforms that would make the system possible. So the big thing is to fight for a public investment authority, and the tools we would need to make it work, like capital controls and breaking the independence of the central bank. So, we could fight for that directly, a public investment body, but we could explain it to the public in really understandable terms that, we have a rich society and a lot of resources, and we want to use it to build housing, to rebuild, the public services that we need and produce the kind of economy that would actually meet our needs. That's how we sell it to people, because this is the only way to do that, is to set up a public investment authority. We could fight for, massive taxes on the rich because of all, not really justified in terms of like, getting the resources we need. I think that's a very false road to go down, that we need taxes to fund things. I think in general, that's a silly idea. But we do need to break the power of the rich to shape democracies. That's the huge thing. We need to break their political power. And so you need very large taxes on the rich. And with capital controls, they can't escape. I don't know why people are always saying, oh, if you tax the rich, they'll leave. Well, if you just put up barriers to exit, they can't take their money abroad. And that's a really important thing we should do. The other thing we have to do is just make life easier for working people, even without public investment. That could look like reductions in length of the work week, increased provision of public services, maybe even a basic income. Those are all things that will create more, possibilities for the future. And I think we have to do a lot to organize workers, whether that's making it easier for them to unionize or engage in collective bargaining, but really ways to allow them to have a much bigger say in the shape of their working lives, and to kind of prepare the kinds of associations and worker organization that we'll need to organize a democratic economy. So, some of those are just things aimed at making people's lives better. The main thing is to argue that we should have no fear about increasing debt, that we're trying to break the capitalist private property system, and we aren't caring that much about those kinds of, things that that people only worry about because they're trying to preserve the private property economy, whereas we're trying to snap it. And, obviously we'd have to show that we are smart and savvy enough that we wouldn't do that in an inflationary way. and that we understand the limits of our ability to import resources and how that would shape what we're able to do. But I think that, unfortunately, maybe for reasons of space or otherwise, the New Left Review didn't print. I had a very long transition program where I laid out the whole way that you would do it. Yeah. But I do think that once you describe the future in the way that I have, it's no more like, what are the little steps we could take? It's like, no, we can say exactly what we need to do to get there, and hopefully build the kind of political will to create this public investment economy to radically reduce the power of the rich to stop us, and to build, both sectional and broad working class power, but also free time and security that would be needed to create those like kind of bottom up building blocks of a democratic economy. I think we could do it all. I think we could achieve most of the transition in like 5 years if we came to power. And I also think that, the left often comes to power in really unexpected ways, like in Bangladesh, for example. And the trick is to actually know what to do if you had power and to not be afraid of the bond market, not be afraid of international capitalist pressure to make the bold moves and go where we need to go with the limited time we would have if we actually had a chance. So not fail like they did in Greece, So, yeah.
Yeah, good point. But first you got to get into power. So just as an outlook, Aaron, there's of course enough evidence that points towards a future that is going to get worse. We talked a bit about some of the trends, but I wanted to know what kind of forces do you see that could actually start, maybe with the slightest pieces such a socialist democratic transition as you have it in mind. If we look at the United States, there is like hopeful signs with the Sanders movement, the Fight Oligarchy tour, also Zoran Mamdani in New York, and maybe in Europe you can identify also some positive changes.
Yeah.
I wondered, from your point of view, what kind of hopeful signs do you see among the better things happening all around us?
Yeah. So I would just say that, in the US, it's really hard. I think people just don't totally take into account how undemocratic the United States is. Like the Constitution and the organization of politics here, it just makes it incredibly hard to, and it's also just a much more unequal society with much more money in politics than in Europe. And so, there has been this effort, and it's very clear at this point that if the Democrats were willing to break with the donor class and with their own, political elites and invest in a left economic populist campaign, none of this culture war stuff would matter. They would have a huge interest, and the partial success of figures like Bernie Sanders and Mamdani, and there's a few others now growing from the bottom up, but in the Democratic Party, but they have very little, they have very little access to the kind of all these hurdles and obstacles are being thrown up against them. I would say in Europe, there's a lot more potential for this because you have also a lot of obstacles to winning, but you have a lot more, you actually have economies that are substantially more democratic in ways that I think people, again, don't even fully realize how much more possibility there is. The problem there is that the EU is a very neoliberal structure. And so you have this federal kind of institution that has limited power and a lot of capacity to constrain what you could do nationally with the kinds of things I'm talking about. So I think that is its own really deep challenge. But I think that, if I have hope, it's something that is unexpected for me in the last 10 years. It's just that we have a growing body of people who want a better world and who want an emancipated future. And I think the big discovery, to my mind, of the past 10 years is the role of canvassing and the role of actually talking to people and not just depending on waves of social movement, but actually building organizations that go knock on doors where people are interacting with and meeting their neighbors and kind of building face-to-face connections that build support. And I think there's a lot of potential for that to build not only political campaigns, but also tenants organizing, renters associations, even workers associations. There's a lot of potential now to, especially in a deeply atomized society, to kind of try to overcome some of those tendencies by talking to people. And I think it also helps break left activists out of their kind of, to use a word that's maybe overused a little bit, but their bubbles and their kind of subcultures and stuff. And so I've seen that already start to transform Die Linke in Germany, the uptake of this model. And I just hope that, there's more and more of an effort on the left, even as we draw a lot of energy from and possibility from big social movements. I think that's how change ultimately happens. But I think that, along the way, we need to try to build a lot more popular support for what we're doing by organizing these campaigns to just talk to people on a really massive scale, working class people. So, yeah, I would say that's where I go. But, I'm a big believer that society goes through these periods of revolution and reform on the one hand and reaction on the other. We're in a big period of reaction now. Periods of reaction have also ended in the past. And, this one looks set to be very destructive, but hopefully, not as destructive as our nightmare scenarios suggest. We should remember that the biggest waves of revolutionary change occurred in the aftermath of World War I and during and after World War II, which were the periods when, if you lived through them, you would have said the world is ending. The world is ending, fascists, genocide. This was all the realities in which people fought for, for massive change in their world. And so let's not let our rational pessimism prevent us from thinking about and actually planning to build that better world, so we're not caught with no ideas, when our chance comes.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for taking your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Ja, Leute, zum Schluss nochmal kurz auf Deutsch. Ich hoffe, ihr hattet Spaß mit der Folge mit Aaron Benanav zu demokratischer Planwirtschaft. Ja, ich versuche ja die Folgen in englischer Sprache in Grenzen zu halten, weil einfach das Publikum dieses Podcasts, das kann ich sehen, ja hauptsächlich aus dem Dachraum kommt. Genau, aber die Chance konnte ich mir nicht entgehen lassen, mit Aaron Benanav zu sprechen, der dankenswerterweise ja hier in den Dissens Podcast gekommen ist, um über sein Beyond Capitalism Projekt zu sprechen, das, so viel weiß ich, noch dieses Jahr auch zu einem Buch werden soll. Da, glaube ich, können wir schon gespannt sein. Diese Folge mit Aaron, die war Teil der Serie Was ist der Plan? Eine lose Serie über die neuere Planungsdebatte und einen emanzipatorischen Planungsbegriff. Ich habe euch in den Shownotes die weiteren Folgen verlinkt. Genau, wenn ihr diese Folgen noch nicht gehört habt, dann zieht sie euch doch gerne rein. Links findet ihr in den Shownotes. Ja, und jetzt sei noch zum Schluss gesagt, ich bin dringend auf euren Support angewiesen, um diesen Podcast hier zu machen. Also, wenn ihr noch nicht dabei seid und euch dieser Podcast hier gefällt, dann schließt doch jetzt bitte eine Fördermitgliedschaft ab. Drückt jetzt auf Pause oder geht am Ende des Podcasts dann in die Shownotes oder auf dissenspodcast.de und ja, werdet Fördermitglieder. Es geht schon ab 3 € im Monat. Ja, und damit sorgt ihr dafür, dass ich von der Arbeit, die ich hier in den Podcast stecke, auch leben kann. Und ihr sorgt dafür, dass alle da draußen diesen Podcast hier kostenlos, unabhängig und werbefrei hören können. Also ja, tut mir den Gefallen, schließt eine Fördermitgliedschaft ab und macht den Dissens Podcast möglich. Das war's dann noch an dieser Stelle von mir. Bleibt nur noch zu sagen, danke euch vielmals fürs Zuhören und bis zum nächsten Mal.